All right. The Visiting Artist Program, funded by PAFA's graduate program, brings an outstanding roster of local artists, national and a roster of local, national, and international artists to PAFA each semester for lectures, critiques, and workshops. The program exposes students and the public to a range of artistic approaches and fosters discussion about contemporary art and ideas. This afternoon, we are pleased to have Paul Rouphail joining us. Paul is born in 1987 from Chicago, Illinois. He received his BFA from Carnegie Mellon University and his MFA from Rhode Island School of Design. His recent solo and two-person exhibitions include Future Machine at the Jack Barrett Gallery in New York, Be Quiet, Smart Objects in Los Angeles, At Home in Stems Gallery, Brussels, A Heart-Shaped Face, also at Jack Barrett Gallery in New York, and recent group exhibitions include Carl Koistal in Stockholm, Sweden, Wow Gallery in Hong Kong, Gallery Sutana in Paris, Smart Objects in Los Angeles, among many more. Paul's work has been reviewed online and in print, including the Contemporary Art Review in Los Angeles, Maake Magazine, Artspace, New American Paintings, Maake Magazine, the Gestalten Press, apologies, Imagine Architecture, among others. Rouphail has an upcoming solo exhibition at STEM Gallery in Brussels in the fall of 2021. He lives and works in Philadelphia, PA, and is represented by Smart Objects in Los Angeles, STEM Gallery in Brussels, and Jack Barrett in New York. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Paul. And Paul, you may now begin sharing your screen.
Okay. Well, first I wanted to extend my thank you to Christy, Lily, and Marley, and Jill for inviting me to be part of the program as a visiting artist. And I want to thank all the students who I met today for sharing your beautiful work and getting to meet each and every one of you and talk to you about your practice. It's been a while since I've been in a e-classroom, or at least been in a context being around students. So it's really wonderful to be able to see student work and to meet each and every one of you. So thank you so much for your time and your energy. I have a lot of slides. I'm going to try to go through as quickly and as succinctly as I can in about a 45-minute period. I've organized the slides more or less in a chronological order, only so that it sort of, I think some of the themes from early in my artistic experience as an undergraduate at Carnegie Mellon and then moving on to this year feels a bit more linear, a bit more streamlined, but I'm skipping a lot of things because of the time limit that we have. So I'm going to start off with a few works that I made a little while ago and talk very briefly about my undergraduate experience living school, my thesis there, and then moving forward from then on out. I started my interest in art. I've always been a painter, but I was primarily interested in film as an artist, and I primarily spent a lot of my time making films as an undergraduate, both narrative and non-narrative videos. I spent a lot of time learning how to actually make 60mm or 8mm films. These are a few screenshots from some narrative and non-narrative films that I made during my undergraduate experience. I've always been interested in placing figures in space, although you'll see that there's a lack of figures in many of my work. But I think that the experiences that I had as a young person trying to make films, aspiring filmmaker, have since matured into different strategies of thinking about how to make paintings. So, in my early 20s making paintings, I was interested in particular in ideas of the American West, even though I wasn't from there. I had grown up in North Carolina, venturing to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., and looking at a lot of Albert Bierstadt paintings and Perfect Edmund Church paintings. Put this on full screen here. As well as I was a big admirer of Edward Hopper and the photography of Robert Adams. In my thesis work, I was interested in the sort of hybridity of the ideas of the American West and literature about the American West as sort of as a spiritual place, as a place for real estate commodification, as a site for militarized testing, and a confluence of these sort of things that conflict with each other that sort of defined our political and cultural of the United States into the West, into the, from the late 19th and early 20th century. Simultaneously, I was interested in some other painters like Albert Pinkham Ryder, for example, with the sort of spiritual and devotional paintings of the natural world, as I was interested in the depiction of sort of technological advancement in the West through illustrations and William Randolph Hearst's newspapers. And my thesis at the time was sort of a confluence of all these three factors that turned into sort of large scale paintings and the sort of the trend of history painting that that use sort of tropes in European landscape painting, tropes and illustration of technological advancement in aforementioned newspapers, and the sort of ideas and sort of romantic proclivities of artists like the people from the Hutton River School, for example. That was in 2010 when I finished undergraduate, and at that point in time, I had left school after the recession in 2008, after the market crash. I was living in the States, and there wasn't a lot of jobs, at least for artists myself. There wasn't a lot of employment opportunities, at least for gainful employment. So my wife and I, my girlfriend at the time, my wife now, we decided to leave the United States, and we moved to Peru for a year, where I spent a year making some paintings, but more or less working as an illustrator for children's books, teaching English, and generally spending my time down there traveling and meeting people. And it was an eye-opening experience in the context of understanding the sort of larger American context outside of the political connotations in being in the States, and got to understand sort of the country and the continent at large through our time there. It was interesting because I think it sort of blew open my ideas of how one might interpret the landscape. And as a foreigner in such a beautiful country, I was sort of interpreted that space with people that we met there. And when we came here, paintings like they would for anybody if they've had a different experience, that my experiences there. To sort of filter at least my pictorial experience of living in South America through the aesthetics that I had already been trying to figure out as an undergraduate and a landscape painter. At the same time, I was reading two books sort of contemporaneously during my time there and when I left. The first was T.J. Clarke's The Site of Death, which is a series of sort of journalistic entries that T.J. Clarke writes about three Nicolas Poussin paintings that he sees in the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. And each entry has a date and a time. He talks about the paintings on the wall primarily, but also about the people moving through the space, how the light changes in the space, and thinking about paintings more in a sort of a humanist manner rather than truly thinking about it theoretically. And the other book was W.J.T. Mitchell's edition Landscape and Power, which is a collection of a variety of essays from really wonderful essays from Charles Harrison to Edward Said about sort of the history of Western landscape painting and the conditions of power, both political and cultural and class, that are sort of relevant to the ways that, at least in the West, that we understand how landscapes are painted and how they are observed. And there was an interesting particular moment in Site of Death that I really loved, where I believe I can remember T.J. Clarke's talking about either the water in a Poussin painting or the tree in the painting, where he talks about this idea of getting away from sort of the hangups of metaphor in painting, where he's talking about stand for something not just notionally, but something visible on its face, that a tree can be a tree, or what can we understand from an artist in the way that he or she might depict a particular item or subject in a painting. And its connotations might leap beyond the sort of the trappings of metaphor, for example, in a particular image. And I was interested in ideas of changing subjecthood, or how subjecthood in a painting might metamorphose based on who's looking at it and what context they're looking at it. And T.J. Clark, at least texturally, allowed me to think about painting in a different way. And so I guess an example for that is this picture was taken by my wife in Peru, was not so much the landscape, but the human space that was being occupied that might tell us about how the landscape is understood. And in Peru, there are these things called combis, which are taxi cabs or sort of private buses that exist outside the boundaries of the sort of public transport system. And each company has their own particular way of branding, has their own colors. A lot of the trucks are adorned with the drivers, either their taste or their religious persuasions. And so on the glass of the driver's side of this bus, a lot of them would have these sort of pasted images. I was riding a bus that would have certain themes and painted, based on a famous soccer team, or ones that are more devotional. And either way, I found that this sort of landscape, the sort of one that was culturally embedded on the surface of things, I found to be of substance in the ways that I was looking for in the natural landscape. And so my paintings began to sort of figure out, or I began to figure out through my paintings rather, a way of trying to understand the culture in whatever setting through the different detritus, or through the sort of the text and pictorial ways in which we encounter the world. So I made some paintings based on takeout container boxes that would contain landscapes on them, that would contain text on them, that would be sort of derivative of certain cliches of cultural identity that were sort of pasted on there. What does a certain text look like? What does it try to represent? In particular, this was a takeout box at an Indian food restaurant in Denver that had, which I thought, the muchas gracias, then a parenthetical thank you translation at the bottom of it. But even the landscape in it follows the same sort of tropes of Western landscape that are so beautifully talked about in Landscape and Power, for example. At the same time, my wife and I, we had bought a fixer-upper house in Pittsburgh when we came back, but we decided to fix up ourselves. It was a lot of YouTubing in the morning and trying to renovate the house in the evening, and we tried to do a good job. We learned a lot in working in the house. We took a break from painting for a year. She's also an artist, and focused on working in this house. And while I wasn't thinking about painting specifically in the context of, trying to renovate this old 100-year-old house in Pittsburgh, I was thinking about the ways in which one, designs one's desires into a physical space, and thinking about T.J. Clark's idea of having something visible on its face more literally, which is the idea of a schematic or a diagram in which one would use. And the map would tell you the key and location or direction that you might take in a specific space. A house might be the same thing. And simultaneously, I was concerned with ideas of perspective. James Elkins talks about this in his book, The Poetics of Perspective, about sort of the history of Renaissance perspective being sort of largely devoid of mathematical meaning and being largely sort of a system of formal puns that are linked together in a single space. And so collage became a really important aspect to me thinking about how to think about landscape and painting. And so I began to leave looking at painters in this sort of like broader Eurocircle standpoint and thinking about the ways that American painting had matured or changed after the war. Otis Kay's super didactic paintings in the 40s about to me, after 2008. And then Stephen Shore's really wonderful photographs about or depicting his experiences of sort of superficial American culture, quite literally the surfaces of food items and surfaces of people's homes, portraits of faces, people inside their domestic spaces in the American West, and American surfaces. His book of photographs was really important to me at the time as well. And moving on from that, in terms of schematics, they don't just are not relative to houses, they're also relative to the way that our history moves. And so I began to look for sort of diagrammatically, the similarities and distinctions between political photography, for example, and romantic landscape painting, or the ways that paintings of like pastoral scenes and property owners would be depicted in front of their property, their spaces. The way that Caspar Friedrich would depict his subjects in front of these sort of like beautiful pastoral landscapes. And so I began to think about a flat plane in which some of these objects might interact with each other. I think I was still concerned with trying to find a sort of a cultural political identity with the paintings, that there might be a link between the cultural politics and the culture of aesthetics. And so when I was in grad school, I was making some of these paintings that felt somewhat more didactic in the ways that the subjects were interacting with each other. Even going back to thinking about houses, this painting is on drywall compound, and the white figures are sort of sanded down into the actual substrate of the painted object. And so the paintings became at that point became less about sort of depth of field, and began to use some of the tropes of landscape painting to sort of figure out, I don't know, maybe certain grad school heady ideas of how one finds themselves in a certain political atmosphere. I don't know. I'm still kind of confounded by them. These were made during a time where I was trying out a lot of different artistic personalities, as it were, as you would do as a graduate student. And they sort of began to blend more into ideas of trompe l'oeil painting. And so for a while, I was making these graph paintings made on windows or on window panes with paint or condiments. I was interested in the way that a schematic works, of the sort of internal logic of a system within a painting, that how they would operate would be, there'd be a series of rules that would be established by the objects in the painting. And those rules would tell you an idea of what's happening in the painting. And if you follow the rules or follow the line of logic, and the painting can somehow reveal itself through its series of tricks, in the way that a very Philadelphia tradition of the way that trompe l'oeil painting might work. That there's a sort of the grab to trick the eye, but there is beneath that a series of proclivities the artist might have to describe a certain sequence of actions. And so a lot of these paintings became about thinking about domestic responsibility, financial anxiety, about desire. I would, in which one might live in one's house, and that a room might be a space where you discuss politics or sex or financial problems. That all these things might sort of swirl in a singular space. I was interested in making paintings that might have a space to occupy all those different ideas. So it was kind of like a painting as a container in which you could pour ideas into. And a few years later, these are a few things that I interacted with or thought about at the time. I had seen the film Phantom Thread, which had a strong impact on me. I was gifted this image on the right. It was a watercolor my grandfather had made. He had immigrated from Cuba as a young kid in the early 20th century, and I made this watercolor painting, a sort of pastoral scene of a Cuban countryside in a studio apartment in the Bronx in the 40s. And we'd always kept this painting in my house, and I was interested in sort of trying to figure out my own lineage as a painter, and the ways in which my family had used painting as a way of not only of adornment in their house, but a way of remembering themselves and their family. And I read this book called The Great Derangement by fiction author Amitav Ghosh, although this is a nonfiction book about the ways in which fiction might adapt to the realities of climate change. And I was struck by a really beautiful quotation in Great Derangement, where Amitav Ghosh talks about the idea of recognition. And he says this in the context of, I believe he's talking about being in Delhi at some moment, and there's a tornado going through the city, which was a complete, which is aberrant from the typical climate situation in the city. And that the idea of recognition is sort of to see something that you know to be true, but that hasn't been realized, but that once realized, you understand it to be, in the context of climate change, something clearly troubling and surprising. And he talks about realizing a truth that you know it's already embedded within oneself, that when it's shown, it becomes real, or that you understand it more clearly. It's being particularly nonverbal, I guess is what he's saying. Similarly, there are so many quotes that I found that sort of restructure this in different ways, which he talks about in Inland Sea, about talking about a particular kind of beauty he's in Japanese poetry and Japanese scenery, and as well in Japanese film, as everything depends on a context. And when a context is shown to be a certain way, that when one's presented with something that you know to be true, once it's being seen, it becomes inevitable. And I think in some ways they're talking about the idea of the sublime, both in literature and in art, but also in nature. And the sublime sort of creates in its own context a whole series of passions and terrors that are implicit with the sublime. And so in art, I became interested in finding ideas of the sublime in multiple modes, either in Giuseppe Arcambolo's paintings, Edward Hopper again, in the films of Stanley Kubrick, and in this one film by Gus Van Sant, My Own Perfect Idaho, in which the character played by River Phoenix talks about being in a landscape and seeing a malevolent face in the horizon line through the landscape, and being terrorized by this thing that keeps chasing him from the horizon line. And how, in this case, psychologically, but also how the natural world and a physical space might act on your own psychology, about yourself or a particular situation. And this desire came up on me. I was making paintings of thinking about how it's also similar to this desire, similar to how we design our home. And I began to think about my grandfather's desire to make this painting in the 1940, to remember something from his youth that had vanished. And I took upon this project of a show, which was to create an ideal room for these things that my family had collected. And the ideal room means that is not physical, but is only made manifest in painting. But to create a home for things that are inevitably vulnerable, as any objects are in a house that we decorate to convince ourselves that we're in a sanctuary or at peace, but a home has its own history that is incongruous with their own history. And so the show came about in Los Angeles, I think in 2018, that was sort of dealing with that issue. And so I began in thinking about Gus Van Sant's film, thinking about, and Giuseppe Arcambolo, about the idea of a face emerging out of a house from the accoutrement in your house, of a house becoming malevolent, or becoming angry with you. One thing I learned in renovating a house, very, in an ad hoc way, is that you can live a house with a house. I was interested in having this idea of making rooms in which all of these possessions would somehow swirl together and then tell you something about yourself, or push you, or have an effect on you that would be different than your initial intentions by collecting these objects. And so I began to make these paintings that were in which faces would appear on the walls or on a table. And this particular show dealt with the idea of sight and the idea of collective vision. So I made these sort of large glasses on a CNC mill. They were then painted and coated. And then they were used as sort of frames in which the painting would fit in like a glasses frame, and kind of like a frame in a painting. And so the show was essentially thinking about the ideas in which the frame is this sort of interlocutor between the sanctity of an image and the sort of chaos of the world outside of it. And the frame is this thing that tries to negotiate the space in between those two different worlds. And so there were frames, then frames. You begin to think about paintings, then paintings, and then the ways that certain aspects of surrealism might be used in painting. So, a painting might sweat like a person. These became became personified, and I thought as objects as acting as people. And then going back to film, I began to think about setting up shows of multiple paintings in a room in which there might be an action, something that happens, and then an event that takes place after the action happens. That may happen in sequential paintings afterwards, but the objects do things, that they have actual praxis in the world in which they exist. This painting was called a Nail in the Sky. These are about 36 inches wide. They're kind of clunky. They're pretty large for glasses frames, naturally, but they're not small paintings. And so, the paintings change over time. They begin to feel like set pieces. I began to think about objects performing gymnastics, objects, things one might do in a stupor, or one might board in their house and finagle with things. I was interested in the idea of living in this sort of constant present in the paintings, that in some ways that they might, in our own, at least in the context of COVID, our own idea of the sort of discontinuous and fragmented series of the present that is affected by our own ambitions, by the news cycle, by phone calls from friends and family, but all these things that sort of invade our present and then move it. I was interested in the idea of a balancing act in paintings, where if I could paint something that can happen only temporarily, that if you take a snapshot, it will last only a second, and freeze it in a painting so that things are perpetually frozen in this time before they collapse, in the way that a film frame might freeze a moment in time. And so these paintings, I think, began to take on this idea of a protagonist. Paintings as being a point of view, the protagonist being a point of view. That protagonist being a version of me, or not me or somebody else, but that a person is affecting the things that are happening in the painting. And it becomes something diaristic. Either it's autobiographical or fictionalized, it doesn't really matter, but that affect is apparent. This painting is called Green Room. It's a big painting. I think I was also thinking about this idea that that color might also do this as well, that rooms would have temperatures. And it wasn't just that the things that are being depicted have an effect on the protagonist in the paintings, but rather I was making a bunch of paintings in which there's 7 paintings in the show. And the 7 paintings had 7 colors, and the colors would then affect the way that the paintings were interpreted. And green was just this thing that was always had a sort of malevolent force in the paintings. This was a show in Europe a few years ago that sort of dealt with similar subjects. This painting is called Celebration. I think it's about 45 inches wide on the longest side. I paint very slowly and very deliberately. I paint from photographs, paint from life, paint from my head. Everything is a sort of a collage of multiple sources, either on my own. This painting is called The Magic Word. My internet's not super permission. Everybody hear me okay? Everyone's good? I want to make sure I'm not speaking into a void. Yeah. In terms of installing shows, I like to think about uh, the room as a stage in the context of an opera, in which case you can think about an opera having a chorus and a singular voice that it becomes like an accordion. It sort of expands and contracts. So I tend to like to make paintings that are either extreme and larger than life in size or very small in scale, like having them very close in proximity with each other. Another important aspect of my paintings is that everything is to scale. Nothing is enlarged or made smaller. So the size of a glass is the size of a glass. Cigarette is the size of a cigarette. It's only the scale of the painting that changes. So sort of going on that idea of trompe l'oeil, that you can feel, that your body is, that the body of the viewer is implied in the space, is really important to me. This painting is called Green Room. And it's called Two Watches. This painting is called Coffee. To give you an idea of how the paintings are made, I don't like to pre-plan paintings. They're not entirely complete in my mind or in a sketchbook or on a computer, for example, before I begin them. I like to think of the paintings as stages. So I typically start with an idea of a space that will eventually be occupied by something or someone. This is a painting from a show last year that I started in my studio. It's about 80 inches long. And so I start with this idea of a landscape or a space in which I want to set a series of objects. And over time, they become more acute. These are the kind of dumb things I do in my studio. Take pictures of items that I sort. In this particular show, I was thinking about the ideas of the show is called The Future Machine. This was in a gallery in New York last year. And the idea was starting with this poem by a Polish poet, Zbigniew Herbert, in the study of an object, where he talks about the idea of the perfect immaterial object. And it becomes a sort of call for affirmation of divinity in the world or in his life, a revelation of sort of a clear insight that it actually exists. But Zbigniew Herbert was a skeptic, and I think that's sort of imbued in this sort of the kind of cynicism in the way that he writes. And I was also thinking about this painting by the artist Peter Bloom, immigrated to the States, and had this painting called The Light of the World, which is this depiction of this artificial sort of light that's exploding in this landscape that is sort of cut into quadrants of this sort of agrarian, bucolic rolling hills of Appalachia and cities of the East Coast, all the promises of the United States, the idea of, the promise of political and spiritual salvation of the country that he immigrated to, and the threat that light in a flash might disappear. And so during COVID, I was thinking about making these paintings in which a person in a room was creating, unlike H.G. Wells, a time machine for themselves out of the objects in their house as a way to transport them out of the stasis of the present. And of course, it's impossible, but in the context of painting, everything is possible because it's a fabricated world. And so the painting, the show became a series of thinking about sort of a hybrid future of hybrid insects living in the world, of light that is struck, being suffused in such a way that it transforms the ordinary into an extraordinary sublime place. And the objects in one's room, through the act of chance, or through the act of magic, or through the act of sheer will, might be transformed into something filled with the possibility of meaning. And so these paintings, use this sort of orb light, cords, books, beer bottles, pictures of family members that would then, and when they would coalesce in the paintings, would then explode into an abundance of light. as a detail of that painting. At the moment, I'm thinking about, this is the last show that I had, was in New York last September. I'm working on a body of work currently for a show in October. I've gone back to thinking a bit more narratively again, thinking about film in particular. And I'm thinking about trying to build, I'm still trying to figure this out, but trying to make a way in which a show might follow a very linear chronological sort of narrative path, in which a protagonist is made more explicit in the paintings. Not necessarily figurative, but I think that because all these paintings imply a certain series of actions or a certain aspects of desire in the paintings, these have allowed me to sort of figure out ways in which a character might be built, maybe made more explicit as the paintings are sort of matured and as you move through a gallery space. And so this is the full image of that last show. And that's it. I'm happy to take anybody's questions for those that may have them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paul. That was lovely. And it's funny, you answered a bunch of questions that I had throughout it. So I really appreciate you taking the time. Sorry, I'm pulling up all of this stuff, but basically now is time for questions and answers. So if you want to take this time to, if you have any questions, to just write them in the box, and I'm just going to kind of go through and articulate them to Paul, and we will take it from there. So the first question that I have is from Evelyn Levitt, and she said, did you find people open to your questioning art discussions, politics, etc.? Your art seems to speak, not just sit.
So the question is, do I find people reticent or eager to have those conversations in a social space? Is that the question?
Evelyn, would you like to elaborate? I can read the question again, asking about if people are questioning your art discussion or politics, but let me see if she just said that she had to leave early 1 minute ago. So I apologize for that. I guess we could just move on to the next question.
Sure, I think that's an open-ended question. I think I can probably get to it together.
Okay, wonderful. Well, actually, the next one was mine, but you did kind of answer it. I guess I was just more curious about your process while you're making these works, and I saw that you had some drawings made out, but I guess I'm just wondering, do you kind of work in thick layer from section to section, or do you layer it almost like watercolor? Like, how do you go about getting this really defined kind of image? Like, how do you get there?
Yeah, I mean, technically they're really thin paintings. I work in a series of layers. I'm not someone who maybe uses grisaille as a method of making paintings, though I have in some paintings, but I'm a bit too impatient for that sometimes. My first layers are usually pretty ugly. I feel how ugly they are, but they change. I usually start with some pretty quick sketches in my sketchbook. I take a lot of photographs with a camera or with my phone. I assemble things sort of collage style in a Photoshop file, and I use that as sort of a basis from which to work. But I love the process of painting, and I personally, I feel like I'm never in the space where I want to feel like I'm painting an image that I've already decided that so I always leave about half the painting available for me to make changes and to discover the painting as I'm making it. but it's true. I don't paint very thick. I paint very slowly, and things are very translucent. I do a lot of glazes and layers. Um, the paintings look like paintings. I mean, there's no desire for them to feel. I'm not like a hyper realist or anything. I think when you get up close, you can clearly see brushstrokes and see the mark of the hand in the paintings. But I like them to feel like they are realized in ways that feel pretty democratic across the entire painting with the way the paint's handled.
Nice. And my only quick comment was that they kind of reminded me of Raymond Carver short stories, some of your paintings. I don't know
Oh, yeah?
familiar with his
That's
work.
interesting.
But I
Yeah,
like
yeah.
On to the next question from Amy Adler. She said that I love your energy, creativity, and vibrance in your work. Do you have any exhibits planned for in New York City this year or next year? And thank you for the wonderful lecture.
Oh, thank you so much for the kind words. Yeah, this gallery is Jack Barrett Gallery, with whom I'm represented in New York City. He's located on Henry Street, downtown. I don't know if he's staying in that space or not. I think, as a lot of galleries are, they're changing their leases, but I will be having a solo show with him as it's planned right now in the fall of next year. So there'll be another solo show in the fall of 2022 in New York City. And occasionally I have some group shows there, but that's the next planned solo shows in New York.
Thank you. Our next question is from Christine, and she said, could you say more about your journey from, in quotations, a tree is just a tree, to your work as a spark for metaphors about the body, home relationships, the ideals of the country, and the sublime? Do you ever find yourself going back to a tree is just a tree?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I mentioned to a student today on one of our crits the paintings of Morandi. I think in its example as this sort of an idea that you can look at something and you feel like it's a painting of a particular image, right? People that are familiar with Morandi's paintings as these sort of Italian painter, these paintings of these sort of platonic solid still life objects, sort of opaque wine bottles and cuboid forms and a table. I was mentioning the writer Peter Schjeldahl talking about his work as being not necessarily a painting of which those are the subjects, but the subject itself, the painting being the atmosphere between himself and the subjects, of those objects on the table. That the subject of the paintings are actually the space that's being shared and the energy that's being shared between himself and his subject. And so, I mean, a tree can't be a tree in a painting because it's not a tree. It's a painting of a tree, and one can't escape that reality that the painting is always going to be mediated because that's the only way that painting exists. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a painting. And so, the subject for me is always going to be that mediation, and whether that mediation becomes subject to the conditions of the author, right? Whether the author is the person for whom our concern is shared and we're looking at a painting, or if you work in a more conceptual manner, that the process by which an image is achieved through a series of actions the artist begins, but in which their ego is surrendered. Those are very different ways of making paintings. I hope there's a way of operating in between those two things. I don't know if I do, but I like to think of myself as maybe an author who makes paintings through an autobiographical lens, but loves to embellish those things. And I think embellishment is what you can do in painting, because that's the magic of it.
Thank you. Our next question is from Matthew Fields, and he said, would you agree that in a way your work speaks to the idea behind painting or art making in general as a desire to capture or keep a moment or a feeling or memory, which even though they are real moments and feelings, they almost feel so surreal that you wish you could have it forever, like a beautiful sunset or two bottles you've perfectly balanced on one another? Very
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I'm always sort of struck between that desire, I think, this sort of human, sort of the innate desire for a particular kind of sentiment. I think that, you know, anybody that, of course, we have subjective experiences and we experience art in different ways, but I think the most powerful art in some ways, or a very powerful way of making art and seeing art is when you can imagine a version of yourself within the world that you're looking at. And when you see yourself somehow reflected, if only acutely in the work of art. And I think my desire is not necessarily to provide a sanctuary for myself or an idealized space or memory of a space, but rather the poetic capabilities of trying to do that in the way that I just described with Morandi. I mean, Gestalten describes the process of painting that atmosphere as being tragic because it's impossible. And that's the tragedy in the poetics of a Morandi painting, is that he's trying to achieve something that with which he can't possibly do because it's a painting and it's static. You can't recreate that atmosphere in static paint. So I try to make paintings that are, while they borrow from the real world and they borrow from my own experience, they're explicitly they're imagined spaces. Like none of the spaces in those paintings they don't exist. They're always hybridized. They're like the background of this painting, for example, is a picture of Philadelphia from my studio, but that's a completely fabricated apartment. It's a fabricated floor. The light's fabricated. The clouds are from a different photograph. Like everything is stitched together in a way where it's it'd be impossible to capture this image with a camera because it can't possibly exist as it is. It might feel like it has the potential for verisimilitude. That might be real. That might be real in the context of how it's organized in space and how the objects are similar in scale to how they are in real life. I feel like my desire is to create spaces and objects and items, just like these sort of silverfish butterfly paintings, that are explicitly slightly outside the realms of the real world. In the way that if you look at a John F. Pito painting at PAFA, for example, like it's exquisite paintings, but then you look at the text of the painting and it's scribble. There's only so much information that he could put into a painting, that the illusion eventually collapses. And I think that like a painter who operates in those ways will understand that when the illusion collapses is where the interesting part of the painting actually happens. You know, like when the painting is finished talking about itself, I think is the interesting part of looking at a painting. And that's what that boundary is I think is what I'm after in certain paintings.
Thank you. Our next question is from David. And I'm sorry, I'm having a blackout. I didn't just read that one, did I? From David? No. Yes.
I think so, I don't know.
Please explain your inner intent of the viewer as they are exposed. Does that sound, I'm so sorry. I'm going to read it. From David, please explain your intent towards viewers as they are exposed to your fine lifelike rendering with both obvious and over-the-head surrealism.
I asked that question. Can you say it one more time? The first part of it?
Yes. Please explain your intent toward the viewer as they are exposed to your fine lifelike rendering with the both obvious and over-the-head realism.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they're kind of like pratfalls a little bit, you know, like, I don't know. I think they're kind of funny too. I mean, I think that's some of the work starts out with humor. I mean, what's funny about creating a world in which items are scaled to the actual scale in the life is that if there's ever an aberration from that world, like say an object enlarges or it becomes small, then it's a way of perverting that space that might be uncanny or funny. Although I don't do that because I think it's like isn't the purpose for me of why I'm making the work that I make. But um, I think of rendering in the way that I render paintings as being, well, I find them in satisfaction. And first of all, I love to paint 3D space where there's only 2D space. But I think it's also, I hope that there's a payoff for the paintings, that when you see a painting from a distance and you go close to it, that like you can find items in the paintings that are lettered in a way that are satisfying. And I want to experience that satisfaction in my studio, and I hope that satisfaction is made visible to the viewers that see the paintings. You know, a lot of the walls and the paintings have like scuff marks in them or scratches. Sometimes they're carved. I mean, there's like little hidden messages hidden in some of the walls. Sometimes there's ways of hiding things in paintings that you can do if you have the personality for it and the time to do it. And I enjoy doing that in the paintings, and I feel like I don't know, like any painter. I mean, these are more disappointing on a camera than I hope people would see them in real life. So yeah, I don't know. I want to meet the viewer at a place where they don't have to really question the way that it's painted, I guess. But why? But what's happening in the painting?
Thank you. And we have another question from Eston Walker. And they say, do you know the book Vibrant Matter by Jane Bennett? If not, you might enjoy the thing power of objects in nature.
I do not know that book, but thank you for the suggestion.
Of course.
I'll write that down.
From them, of course. Well, those are all the questions that we have. We do still have a couple more minutes. If anybody else has any other questions that they'd like to get in here before we end this lecture, take the time now to put them in the chat box. All right, well, I think that concludes today. Paul, I want to say thank you so much for your lecture. We are so grateful to have you. I'm going to now stop the recording